Hi guys, Forgotten Wolf here, and this is the rise, fall, and rise again of Sansa Stark. How she went from a girl that knew nothing to Queen in the North. This is episode 3 of the Life of series. Sansa Stark is the eldest daughter of Lord Ned Stark and Lady Catelyn Stark. Sansa was their second child, born in 285 AC. Growing up, she had a poor relationship with her sister Arya and her bastard brother Jon Snow. That'll be important later. Sansa Stark grew up always having the dream of marrying a young prince and ruling as queen. She thought the real world was like how the singers and story writers told it, which isn't the case. You'll see what I'm talking about later on. This would doom her. In 298 AC or Season 1, King Robert Baratheon offered Ned Stark the title of Hand of the King. In addition, Robert had the great idea of joining their houses. Robert proposed they betroth Prince Joffrey Baratheon to Sansa Stark. Sansa was very eager about this opportunity to become a queen, and Ned would accept this and bring both his daughters south. Joffrey was in love with Sansa until they got to the shrine where Arya embarrassed Joffrey and her direwolf bit him before running away. Sansa would witness this and Joffrey hate that she saw this and from then on was cruel to her. And yeah, because Joffrey realized Sansa didn't see him as invincible, when in reality she still did see him as invincible. However, after a long journey, Sansa reached King's Landing. There, she would watch the hands tourney and met Littlefinger, the master of coin. However, eventually the Stark-Lannister relationship would grow even worse, and Ned planned to send both his daughters back to Winterfell for their own safety. Sansa would protest, however, she got her way, as they didn't go back north because Ned Stark had a failed coup against Joffrey and Ned would be taken prisoner. Arya would escape King's Landing, however, and Sansa was taken captive by the Lannisters. This would force Robb Stark into declaring war, and the War of the Five Kings started. Joffrey remained betrothed to Sansa for now, but Sansa begged for Ned's life to Joffrey, and Joffrey said should be mercy so long as Ned acknowledged him as the true king. At Ned Stark's trial, Ned Stark acknowledged Joffrey as the true king, but it didn't matter as Ned would be executed by Joffrey. Joffrey made Sansa look at Ned's severed head and promised to deliver Robb's head to her. In 299 AC, or Season 2, Sansa Stark would be caught up in the riots at King's Landing and almost be, raped to death by some common folk. But the Hound saved her and brought her back to the safety of the Red Keep. Later in the season, Sansa would flower and be able to bear children. She feared this, not wanting to marry Joffrey after he killed her father, and although Shae, Sansa's maid, tried to hide that Sansa could bear children, Queen Cersei found out and talked to Sansa about the future of marrying Joffrey and giving him kids. She would wed when the war was won. However, Robb Stark secured a major victory at Oxcross in the War of the Five Kings, and when King's Landing found out, Joffrey would summon Sansa to the throne room and would have her abused, and Meryn Trent would beat her. However, Tyrion stepped in and shut Joffrey out of abusing her for now, and Tyrion would apologize to Sansa. Then the Battle of Blackwater Bay came next, and the Hound offered to bring Sansa back to Winterfell and back to Robb, although it's not known if the Hound knew that Winterfell had fallen to Theon Greyjoy at this point, and both of Sansa and Robb's brothers were dead, or thought dead. Sansa refused it, having confidence in Stannis' victory. Stannis would not win, however, as the Tyrells joined the Lannisters in exchange for Joffrey to put Sansa aside and marry Margaery Tyrell. The Lannisters accepted this proposal, and the Battle of Blackwater Bay was won by the Lannisters. At the end of the season, Joffrey put Sansa aside in front of everyone, which Sansa was thrilled with, although Littlefinger told her now Joffrey can give her bastard children instead of trueborn ones. In 300 AC, or Season 3, it would be the last year of the War of the Five Kings. Sansa was still a captive in King's Landing, but the Tyrells wanted to get to know her. They had Sansa tell them about Joffrey, to which Sansa eventually told them why Ned Stark died and revealed that Joffrey was a monster. Sansa Stark's testimony would start the planning of the Purple Wedding and Joffrey's death, and for Margaery to marry Tommen. Margaery would also convince Sansa to come to Highgarden when Joffrey was wed to Margaery, and have Sansa marry Larys, usurping the North from the Lannisters. However, this never happened, as Larys Tyrell's squire told Littlefinger this plan, and who in turn told Cersei, and then Cersei told Tywin, the Hand of the King. However, Sansa was so confident in marrying Loras that she actually refused Littlefinger's offer to bring her to the Vale with him when he married Lysa Arryn. This would be a mistake, as against Sansa's will, she'd end up marrying Tyrion Lannister, the Imp, just for her claim to Winterfell. They would be married, and Tyrion would predictably get drunk at his own wedding night, and Joffrey would torment Sansa some more. However, against all the other Lannisters, Tyrion would refuse to consummate his marriage to Sansa. It'd be the second half of the season where Sansa Stark would grow into a depression while being married to Tyrion. This would be even worse, as after Robb Stark was killed at the Red Wedding, Sansa wouldn't eat and wouldn't do anything. However, she would have a long talk with Tyrion, and Tyrion reminded her that although her mother was dead, she wouldn't want this to hold Sansa back, and she would want her to be strong. This would bring Sansa back up, just in time for Joffrey's wedding day. In 301 AC, or Season 4, it started with the Purple Wedding, where Joffrey was poisoned using a necklace that Sansa wore on the wedding day given to her by Joffrey's fool, Sir Hallard. Sansa witnessed Joffrey's death before being escorted out of King's Landing by Sir and was escorted to a ship which Littlefinger owned, and then predictably killed Sir and Littlefinger was traveling to the Vale. The Lannisters found the necklace and would suspect Sansa and Tyrion of poisoning King Joffrey, which meant for Nat, Sansa would take on the disguise of Elaine, such Littlefinger's bastard daughter. Littlefinger and Sansa would have a long talk in which Littlefinger would begin to teach Sansa how to play the Game of Thrones, and would repeatedly do so throughout her time in the Vale. And Littlefinger confirmed that he and the Tyrells poisoned Joffrey, although it was intended to be overnight rather at the wedding feast, but it still worked out. This is where the young, immature Sansa died, and the new Sansa rose, ready to play the Game of Thrones. Sansa Stark would finally arrive at the Vale and meet the last of her kin, Lysa Arryn, her aunt. Lysa would be overjoyed to see Sansa and would tell her that Tyrion would surely be executed for being accused of murdering Joffrey, and then Sansa would be free to marry Robin. Sansa would meet the young Lord Robin Arryn, and they had a good relationship, however, more so of an older sister and younger brother. However, Littlefinger would give Sansa a non-consensual kiss, and this drove Lysa insane, as Lysa would confront Sansa in front of the moon door, threatening to throw her out. However, Littlefinger saw this and instead threw Lysa out at the moon door, ending her life. This will be important later on. In Season 5 or 302 AC, Littlefinger would be tried by Lord Royce for murdering Lysa Arryn, and Sansa would reveal her identity to the Vale, but not the whole realm. Sansa would finally play the Game of Thrones and spare Littlefinger by saying Lysa Arryn committed suicide. This was Sansa's first major decision to trust Littlefinger, something that would be the wrong decision. After Littlefinger was cleared, it's not shown, but it's implied that Sansa and Tyrion's marriage would be annulled by a septon. However, after Robert Arryn was sent to foster with Lord Royce, Sansa Stark would be revealed to be marrying again. That's why Littlefinger annulled her marriage to Tyrion. Littlefinger broke his trust and relationship with Sansa by betrothing her and marrying her to Ramsay Bolton, the family who murdered Robb, her brother. Sansa would go back home, this time against her will. Littlefinger dropped her off, then married her to Ramsay Bolton. There she would reunite with Theon Greyjoy, and she would break him and snap him out at being Reek. However, unlike Tyrion, Ramsay Bolton would consummate his marriage to Sansa, and Sansa cried for Theon to get him out, as Theon was the only person who knew every night and cared about Ramsay abusing Sansa and being a worse version of Joffrey. Sansa would still cry to Theon, but then she saw Stannis again, trying to take Winterfell from the Boltons. However, Stannis would be defeated at the Battle of Ice and died. It would be at this point where Littlefinger finally told Cersei and King's Landing that Sansa was alive and married to Ramsay Bolton, pitting Sansa's two biggest enemies against each other. However, Sansa wouldn't stay in Winterfell forever. In Season 6 or 303 AC, Sansa would try to escape with Theon killed the guard to send Sansa back to her chambers, and Theon got Sansa out of Winterfell and got her to the safety of Brienne of Tarth and Bran's squire Podrick. Brienne would then become the first knight to enter Sansa's service. Then the first knights warned her. Theon had redeemed himself and now decided to go home to the Iron Islands. Sansa, meanwhile, went to Castle Black and the Wall, where she had previously learned that Jon Snow, her half-brother, was the Lord Commander there. However, when she got there, the two had an emotional reunion, and this made some viewers cry. Jon would reveal that he had died but been brought back to life and freed from his Night's Watch vows, and would stay with Sansa no matter what. Sansa told Jon of her intention to take Winterfell back for the Starks, but Jon didn't join yet. However, Ramsay sent a letter saying he was Lord of Winterfell, having killed his father Roose, and the Umbers handed Rickon Stark over, and Ramsay taken him prisoner. This is where Jon joined Sansa, and the two would be determined to take back Winterfell in the Battle of the Bastards. However, Sansa got a visit from Littlefinger, who offered the Knights of the Vale, but Sansa, realizing Sansa didn't trust Littlefinger, and rejected him for now. But Sansa did learn that the Blackfish had reformed the Tully army and held Riverrun. Sansa sent Brienne to get the Tully army to their cause, but Sansa had lied to Jon about how she got the info, saying Ramsay, "You got a raven." She also didn't tell Jon about the Knights of the Vale, as she began to lose her honor. However, in Jon and Sansa's quest to win the Northern Houses, they discovered that Robb had seriously lost them, as although the Mormonts and other small houses joined them, the Glovers rejected them and stayed neutral, and the Karstarks joined the Boltons. Jon still had the wildlings, but Sansa realized that if the Tully army came, which they very likely wouldn't, they needed more men, as in the Game of Thrones Legends game implies. Sansa rode off in the night, sending a letter to Littlefinger asking for his men, which Littlefinger was bringing anyway. Sansa Stark got the Knights of the Vale, and when she arrived, she discovered that Jon and the wildlings were surrounded by the Bolton army. However, the Knights of the Vale broke the surrounding Bolton army and started sieging Winterfell as Jon and the wildlings flooded the castle, and Jon captured Ramsay, beating him to death. After the Starks regained control over Winterfell, Jon named Sansa Stark the Lady of Winterfell. As Sansa deeply apologized to Jon for not telling about the Knights of the Vale, Jon forgave her, and Sansa, did this. Sansa Stark had risen from captive to claiming her birthright as Lady of Winterfell after Robb's death. However, Sansa and the other northern lords would name Jon Snow King in the North for winning the Battle of the Bastards. In Season 7 or 3 of 4 AC, Sansa tried to get Jon to strip the Karstarks and Umbers of their castle, but Jon wouldn't punish a son for the reckless actions of a few lords. An unpopular decision, but also decided to accept Daenerys' invite to a Dragonstone, which annoyed a few lords. Sansa would then hold the North, keeping the North on Jon's side. However, Sansa would finally be reunited with her last of her living siblings, Arya and Bran. The three were divided at first just because of how much they changed. However, Littlefinger gave Bran the dagger that started the War of the Five Kings, and this would reunite the three Starks, as Sansa would used faking Arya being tried in order to lure Littlefinger in, and then would try Littlefinger for his crimes. Sansa and Bran used the info they had seen about Ned's arrest, his execution, and Lysa's death, turning the Knights of the Vale to her side and away from Littlefinger. Sansa sentenced Littlefinger to death, and Arya Stark would execute Littlefinger for his crime. However, later in the season, Sansa would learn that Jon bent the knee to Daenerys and they had a new queen, and Sansa was not happy about that. And Daenerys would bring her whole army to defend the North from the White Walkers. In Season 8 or 305 AC, Sansa would meet Daenerys, and Sansa resisted Daenerys, and the two would not like each other, as Sansa realized what Jon hadn't. Daenerys as a Targaryen would only meet those who bent the knee with fire and ash, not a chance of forgiveness or justice. However, it was time for the battle against the White Walkers, and they would win as Arya Stark killed the Night King. Sansa, however, didn't realize Daenerys' help and grow mad at Jon for continuing to fight by her side and refusing to rest. Daenerys would go south with Jon, Arya, and the rest of her army. However, before leaving, Jon told Sansa, Arya, and Bran about his true parents, Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. Sansa swore not to tell, but then she went right after that, broke Jon's trust, and told Tyrion Daenerys' hand in order to try and get Jon crowned over Daenerys. Tyrion did nothing with the knowledge, however. However, Daenerys took King's Landing and burnt the city. This resulted in Jon Snow being arrested, and in response, Sansa and Bran brought the whole northern army to King's Landing to free Jon. However, a great council was called to discuss the fate of Jon and Tyrion. Tyrion suggested Bran was king, and it was agreed that Bran Stark became king. But Sansa wouldn't bend the knee and declared that the North would be an independent kingdom, as they once were, and she would rule as Queen of the North, which Bran allowed. As Jon, it was agreed, would be sent to the wall as a compromise. The Starks said their goodbyes, and Sansa went back to Winterfell, which she would be named the Queen in the North, fulfilling her life to this point. That is it for me. If you want more like this, I'll continue to do this new series of Life of Characters. There's a new playlist out. So yeah, if you want more like this, at 100k views, I'll do a video on the life of Tywin Lannister. And at 1k likes, I'll do a video on the life of Robert Baratheon. But until next time, bye!